The sun rose pale and half-forgotten above the stern of the São André, a three-masted carrack bound north from Lisbon toward icy waters no man cared to name. Its wood was aged and salted, its sails patched with hemp taken from older tragedies. The air smelled of deck scrub, brine-stained lines, and the lingering scent of stews gone wrong. Below decks, the crew stirred. They rose with the creaks and sighs of the ship, not by call of bell or word of command. Their bodies were lean, each rib a faint ridge beneath stained canvas shirts. Their eyes glinted at the noise of footsteps overhead. They knew this hunger. It was different from starvation. It burrowed in bones and logic. The ship's surgeon, Luis Ferreira, led the subdued procession from galley to deck. His hands shook slightly. At 37, he had seen too many voyages end in graves, rowed home with broken names. In his satchel, dried oranges moulded at the edges, vinegar cloudy with sediment, dusty sea biscuits, pig's fat pressed in barrels, a small packet of pepper he kept locked for emergencies. A plank was laid across 2 barrels. Along its length, wooden bowls chipped at the rim, filled with pea soup tugged with salt. Stale bread that crackled beneath tooth, and salted pork, pale and stiff. They ate it in silence, faces silent but ragged. "Eat," said Louis softly, "before the wind freshens." They ate. They knew the cost. Above, first mate Jorge Costa stood beside the cook's hatch. He was the ship's truth and its fury. Battle-scarred, words few, hands swift. He watched them. Some ate fast, others picked. Some didn't eat at all, staring at glinting sea like it might offer something else. He reached down, grabbed a half-eaten pig fat, and tossed it back into the barrel. The boy beside him met his gaze and nodded. Costa said, "Lean meat goes to the lungs. We need blood." He spat. On deck, sails filled with a sharp wind. Clouds piled in the north. The ship pitched. Louis dropped to his knees, not for prayer, but to brace. He closed his eyes and steadied his breath. Inside him, a tired voice whispered, "Give them fresh fruit. Give them oranges. Give them limes." But there were none. There had been none since Malta. That night they cooked what could cook. Stew of damp pork, peas, and sea vinegar. Jorge stirred the pot. The smell rose, a heavy promise of fullness, but also of decay. They served it up, served it down. In the light of lanterns, a sailor named Tomas fell limp, his bowl still half full, his face pale. The surgeon searched him. He detected a faint swell in the gums, bluish, scurvy, a soft death that begins with dust in your eyes, joint pain, bleeding gums, and then weakness. Louis lifted Tomas's chin. "Tart fruit," he said into the boy's ear. Tomas only closed his eyes. That night, the ship's quarters were still, but for Thomas's soft moans. The rattling of the ship was gone. The air smelled of medicine, distilled vinegar, crushed herbs, and fear. Louis looked at a faded sawtooth wall. 30 men before, how many would go after? He knelt by Tomas. He squeezed his hand. "You'll eat on the morrow," he promised. "I'll see it." Dawn came with no mercy. The wind had sharpened. The sea behind them roared. Luis went to the deck. He stood beside Jorge. The first mate looked at him. "Captain?" Luis asked. The captain leaned forward from behind the wheel. "What do you have?" Luis raised a single orange, cracked and bruised, not in his satchel. They all stared. "How did you get that?" the captain asked. "I bought it in Cadiz," Luis whispered. "Paid half my share." A pause. Then, "For one. One will save a man." The captain looked down at Thomas's bowl, still cold beneath his bunk. He exhaled, hard. "Then let the ship trade for fruit." And so, the São André changed course, to Madeira. Wind shifted, the air softened as though the ocean recognized mercy. Rumoured storms still curled on the horizon, but they were welcomed now by hungry men. Luis slept poorly. He thought of Lisbon. of oranges pressed into wine on warm autumn nights. He thought of voyages that never touched land. He thought of every mouth on board that would widen with hope. By nightfall they reached port. Men climbed into longboats, landing at rooted docks. The market was chaos. Crates of oranges, lemons, limes, green and bright as life itself. The air smelled sweet. They traded. They carried barrels to the ship. They cheered. They did not realize how this feast would define the fall of men, and how sacrifice could taste like joy and like the skin of apples grown too little. That night, lanterns swung across the deck. Luis prepared fresh slices of orange for Thomas. He watched the boy eat. He breathed freedom he hadn't realized he'd lost. He saw hope. But as the fruit drained in, one question grew louder in his mind. What will we sacrifice next? The São André left Madeira fat with barrels, limes, oranges, dried herbs, salted fish soaked in citrus brine. The crew laughed for the first time in weeks. Gums stopped bleeding. Feet felt lighter. Luis Ferreira, the ship's surgeon, walked the deck with quiet pride, nodding at faces that had regained their colour. But hope spoils faster than fruit. By the 20th day at sea, the barrels began to empty. The salt air aged everything. The fish turned sour. The oranges collapsed into mush. The limes, still green, grew soft at the core. The moisture invited mould. Luis scraped it away. But mould has memory. It returns where it was not asked. Below deck, hunger began its second life. Not loud, not panicked, just lingering. Thomas had survived. He stood at the helm now, stronger, sharper. His breath no longer stank of blood. His smile had returned. But he ate slower than the others, savoured each peel, each rind, like a man remembering a dream. He had learned, Luis noted, to fear absence. "You'll ration your joy now," Luis said one night. Thomas looked up. "Is that what this is? Joy?" "No," Luis said. "It's survival pretending." They entered colder waters. The ship groaned with the shift. Wind lashed from the west. Storms stalked behind them like wolves. Salt crept into every joint of the vessel. Water supplies grew thin. Barrels once filled with drinking water now sloshed with brine. And with it came the hunger that no meat or citrus could fix. The craving of the human body when fed too little of the right thing, and too much of the wrong. The salted pork was no longer meat. It had become a joke, grey and slick, and sometimes green. The biscuits were riddled with weevils. The men no longer bothered to remove them. One bite, crunch, gone. "You eat them?" Louis asked Jorge one morning. The first mate nodded. Extra protein. By the 30th day, 3 men had fallen. Not from scurvy, but from infection, exhaustion, and hopelessness. They whispered of strange things in the night. The sea glowed when it shouldn't. The stars danced. One man swore he saw a woman walking the mast. Luis knew the signs. Salt poisoning, dehydration, starvation cloaked in madness. He opened his surgeon's chest, only a few vials left. Vinegar, crushed mint, dried bark. Nothing that could save a soul. Just enough to ease its leaving. One morning, a boy named Mateus collapsed on the main deck. His lips cracked. His eyes rolled back. Luis ran to him, lifted his head, and shouted for water. Jorge appeared, carrying a small ladle. "Only a sip," he said. Luis hesitated, then poured it gently into Mateus's mouth. He swallowed, breathed, and whispered, "My tongue tastes salt." "There is no other taste out here," Luis replied. That night the officers met in secret. The fruit was gone. The meat was low. The water barely 2 days' worth. They stood around a lantern, faces pale and eyes tired. "We change course?" one asked. "Toward where?" said another. "There's a Dutch settlement south of here," the captain offered. Jorge spat. "That's a week out." We won't last 4 days." A silence followed. Then Louis said, "We cut rations." "No," the captain said. "They'll revolt. They'll die anyway," Louis replied. A longer silence, then a nod. They announced it the next morning. Half rations. Water, once given in cups, now in thimbles. Salted fish shared between 3. Biscuits crumbled and stirred into vinegar like gruel. One man, furious, threw his bowl overboard. That night he wept in his hammock. Not from pain, but from shame. Louis spent his days dividing rot from rot, cutting blackened meat into barely edible cubes, straining vinegar through cloth, brewing tea from mouldy lemon peels and seawater, praying it wouldn't kill more than it helped. He didn't sleep. He had no right to. On the 37th day, the skies cleared, the stars returned, the sea turned gentle, but the men had no joy left to greet it. They were thin and silent, faces hollowed, eyes distant. One man whispered to another, "If he dies before you, would you—" Louis heard, pretended he hadn't, because once that question is spoken, the ship is no longer a ship. It becomes a tomb that floats. He wrote in his journal that night. They no longer asked for food, only for the taste of memory. He closed the book and prayed. Not to be saved, but that no man would be hungry enough to forget what made him human. By the 40th day, food was no longer nourishment, it was negotiation. Every bite passed between fingers like gold. Every swallow came with a choice. Finish it now and feel full for a minute, or save it and risk losing it in the night. The Saint-André had become a ship of shadows. Men whispered instead of spoke. They moved slower, their muscles drawing on memories of strength. Skin thinned, eyes dulled. No one joked anymore, and Louis had stopped counting the dead, not out of cruelty, but because there weren't enough words left in him to write the names. One morning the wind vanished. The ship floated on a mirror of still sea, no sails to fill, no direction. And in that stillness the sickness spread. Not scurvy, not fever, desperation, the kind that arrives without warning and speaks in your own voice. Louise found a man in the galley gnawing on a piece of leather strap, soaking it in water to soften it. He didn't even look up as Louis entered, just chewed like a beast, eyes empty. In the hold, another had crushed his sea biscuit into powder, mixed it with sweat, and tried to drink it through a cloth. His lips bled. And then, quietly, one of the youngest crew members, barely 15, was gone. No splash, no sound, just gone. Some say he slipped overboard in the night. Others say he jumped, but no one searched, no one asked. Because some answers are too costly. That night, Louis met with the captain, Jorge, and 3 of the strongest men still standing. The candle flickered in the captain's quarters, smoke curling like a question they didn't want to ask. "We're 6 days from land," Jorge said. "At best." Louis stared. "And how many will still be alive?" The captain rubbed his temples. "We've run dry. The rain barrel is empty. The lemon vinegar's gone. There's 1/3 of a barrel of salted pork." "A third won't feed a dozen," Louis replied. "It's not for a dozen," the captain said flatly. A silence fell. The unspoken truth had finally stepped into the light. Jorge leaned forward. "We choose 5, the strongest. We feed them, water them, keep them alive. They'll get us to land." "What about the others?" Louis asked. Jorge didn't blink. "They've already died. Their bodies just haven't caught up." Louis stood. "That's murder!" "No," said the captain. "It's math." That night, Louis returned to the crew and said nothing, but his hands shook. He stood in the shadows and watched them. Some lay still, lips cracked, eyes open to the stars. Others curled around bowls with nothing inside. Thomas sat alone, chewing the last of a lime peel he'd hidden in his shirt. He looked up at Louis. "Who decides who lives?" he asked. Louis couldn't answer, because he already had. The next morning, the 5 were chosen, not by vote, by silence. They were given extra water, 1 chunk of pork each, a full biscuit, quietly, without ceremony. No one else was told. But they didn't have to be. The rest of the crew saw their bellies fuller, their eyes clearer, their steps surer, and in that moment the Saint Andre split in two, those who might survive, and those who would not. It didn't take long. The whispers began. Then the accusations, then the fights. By sunset, one man had attacked Jorge with a broken spoon. He was thrown overboard, not with violence, with sorrow. Luis tried to pray that night, tried to remember words that used to comfort him, but all he could think of was the taste of orange rind and the smell of blood in salt. In his journal he wrote, "We are not explorers anymore. We are something older, something deeper. We are hunger, and hunger does not sail. It consumes." The final collapse came quietly. A man died in his sleep. Another refused to wake the next day. By then, there were 13 still breathing, 5 fed, 8 fading, and still no sign of land. Then on the 47th morning, someone made a choice. Luis woke to find one of the starving men missing. At first, they thought he'd gone mad and leapt, but then someone found a pile of bones behind the barrels, stripped, boiled, and a pot still warm. Jorge stood with his fists clenched. Luis couldn't speak. The captain turned to the men and said, "There will be no punishment, because if we damn him, we damn us all." That night, Luis poured the last of the water into a cracked cup. He took a sip. Salt. Still salt. On the 51st day, the wind returned. It arrived like grace, soft, sure, steady. The sails snapped back to life, and the Saint Andre moved once more, cutting through a sea that shimmered like spilled mercury beneath a cold sun. No one cheered, no one had the strength. Below deck, the air was thick with the scent of sickness, mould, and secrets. The crew, what was left of them, lay like shadows on the planks, their bodies gaunt, their cheeks sunken, their eyes hollow. They did not speak any more. They dreamed in fever. Luis moved among them like a ghost, checking pulses, wiping brows, pressing cracked lips with cloth soaked in brackish water. His own mouth was dry, his mind flickering in and out of thought. He could no longer remember what fresh bread smelled like, or the warmth of sun on fruit, but he still remembered guilt. Jorge was silent now. His strength hadn't saved him. The extra rations had only delayed the inevitable. He sat at the stern, arms limp, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You are supposed to live," Louis whispered. Jorge blinked, but said nothing. Then on the morning of the 55th day, someone cried out. A shape on the horizon, faint, unmoving, green. Land. Not imagined, not whispered, real. And for the first time in weeks, every man aboard stirred. Tomas pulled himself to his knees. His gums were black at the edges, but he smiled. Luis wept. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, just a slow, exhausted breaking. They had made it, or what was left of them had. As they neared the coast, the island revealed itself. Jagged cliffs, palm trees swaying, a beach that glittered like promise. Smoke curled in the distance. Someone else was here, or had been. They dropped anchor and lowered a boat. Luis and 2 others rowed slowly toward shore, muscles trembling with each stroke. The surf crashed gently. The keel scraped sand. And then... Earth! Real. Warm. Solid. Luis collapsed to his knees, pressed his hands into the soil like it was holy, like it would forgive him. They found coconuts first, then small crabs, then a trickle of fresh water from a stream. They ate without words, they drank without prayers. There was only need, and silence, and breath. Later, Luis walked alone into the jungle. He needed to be away from the others, from the ship, from the memories that hung on every salted rope. He found a clearing and sat. The air buzzed with insects. Life was everywhere. He took out his journal. The pages were warped, stained with salt, blood, and tears. He wrote slowly. We survived, but we did not all come home, not to land, not to humanity. What we became out there will not follow us ashore. It cannot. The sea takes, yes, but worse, it asks what you're willing to give, and we gave too much. We traded our innocence for meat, our friendship for silence, our souls for one more day. But we are here, and that means something. I think. I hope. He closed the book, looked to the sky. The stars would come out soon, and he knew, without checking, that they would be exactly where they had always been. The next morning, they burned the Saint Andre. It had carried them through fire and famine, through madness and miracles. But it would not carry the truth of what happened. The flames licked the sky, black smoke curling into the wind. And as the sun rose, Lewis and the others turned inland, away from the water. Not toward new land, but toward new selves. Because the sea does not care who you are when you leave, only who you are when you return. And sometimes you don't.